For those of you who don't know, Eric is the author of a book called The Lean Startup, which has been very influential on the work that Code for America does, and I think increasingly at other levels of government as well. We thought it'd be a really good opportunity to have Eric talk a little bit about the Lean Startup methodology and why it makes sense for government. One of our goals at Code for America is to bring the best practices of the technology industry to government. And clearly there's a lot that we do with open data, there's a lot that we do with citizen engagement, but we also do something that has to do with these ideas that Eric has talked about. So let's start from the top. Tell us, what is the Lean Startup methodology?
First, thank you very much for having me. This is a real honor. I feel like I should start with my background, which is as a technology entrepreneur and as an engineer. My shelf was full of O'Reilly books back in the day. And I thought that I would spend my whole life writing software for a living. I was pretty excited about that as a career path. And I kept having the experience that a lot of us have had in town here, which is building really incredible technology that even today nobody is using. Because even though it was really outstanding from a technical point of view, there were no customers for it. And I didn't think that was my problem as an engineer. My job is just to make the technology and somebody else figures that other stuff out. But that kept happening to me over and over again, and I kept failing for that same reason. And I started to work on this idea that eventually became called Lean Startup, which is to take ideas from lean manufacturing about bringing customers into the process of development early, about improving cycle time, and about testing things scientifically, quickly, and cheaply. And use that as a methodology to help improve entrepreneurial outcomes. And I started out just talking about that as a phenomenon for software and high-tech companies. I didn't imagine that it would blossom into this thing that has basically taken over my life since the book came out last year. So this is quite a thrill for me. Nice to meet you.
Yeah. So Jen talked in her talk about that we're trying to evolve, and I think she also may have mentioned the term MVP, which. So this is this sort of funny jargon out of Lean Startup. So what is an MVP and how does that fit into how we ought to be thinking about software development in companies and in government?
Yeah, so we are known for jargon in the Lean Startup movement. And people have been using the word pivot too often, that's basically our fault, so I'm sorry about that. I do apologize. And MVP is right up there, probably with Pivot, or maybe second. But the concept is what we call a minimum viable product. And when we're thinking about a new product initiative, somehow we really are, as human beings, are drawn to the 5-year plan and to the really expansive vision of the fully realized idea. And that's how all the products I wound up building, basically failed, because if some element of the 5-year plan, if one of the key assumptions that it's based on turns out to be incorrect, like that people don't want to use this piece of technology, then you don't really find that out until year 5 of the 5-year plan. And that's not a technology-specific thing. I've worked with teams that have a 5-year plan in government, in industry. I was just with an industrial manufacturing company that was building a new engine, and they have this 5-year plan. And in year 6 of the 5-year plan, of course, they're going to make $100 million because they're going to launch the engine and everyone's going to buy it. But until year 6, we get no feedback at all about whether we're on the right track or not. So minimum viable product says, our goal as innovators is actually not just to build a product, it's to conduct an experiment that will help us figure out if our plan makes any sense at all. Let's figure out how to run the smallest experiment necessary to get that learning. And when we think about it from that point of view, a lot of what we used to call requirements are actually revealed to be hypotheses. And some of those hypotheses are basically crazy, that are 100% absolutely wrong. And so if they're that wrong, we can find that out. We don't need 1 million customers to all tell us that they don't want to do the thing that we want. We can find that out maybe with 10 customers. And we don't need a product. I had this experience many times in my career of building products that nobody would download. So it doesn't really matter how many features they had, or how many bugs they had, or what happens in the 20th hour of the customer experience if we can't get people into the first hour. So that's the logic of minimum viable product. So let's figure out the minimum necessary to begin the process of learning and iteration, and then let's use that to inform the rest of the plan so that we can increase our odds of success.
Right, so those of you who are in government know how much at odds with the normal way that you procure software that methodology is. Because in fact, government software is typically highly over-specified before you actually build anything. And in a lot of ways, Code for America is a hack on the procurement system. Because what you do, instead of specifying in great detail, this is the product we want, as you do with normal software, instead you procure this team of smart people who proceed to build minimum viable products, who proceed to say, okay, here, you've got a problem, let's see what we could do about it. And work through a process of rapid experiments to figure out whether the hypotheses that you might have about how to solve that problem are in fact correct. And of course, that then you very quickly see that you can often build things very, very quickly that will tell you whether you're on the right track or not.
Or let's be honest, more often not. And that's actually where the tremendous savings come in. So people think sometimes lean government, that can have negative connotations, meaning layoffs and kind of hack and slash. But what we're talking about is government and all organizations that are more efficient at figuring out the right things to build, instead of how our usual development processes are configured, which are to very efficiently build whatever is specified. So I have this image in my head all the time that we're driving a car straight off a cliff, but we're doing it very efficiently. We're getting excellent gas mileage, right, even as we go right over, and we're proud of ourselves because we're on time, on budget. We did what we said we're going to do, except if we're building something that nobody wants, why would we be proud that we did that on time and on budget? So it's like a reframing of what our goals in development are in the first place, to focus on learning, iteration, and experimentation.
Yeah, so talk about learning. Clearly a big part of your methodology has to do with closing the loop on, data. Because obviously if you're doing experiments, you actually have to measure the results.
Yeah.
How do you think about that in the context of software development? What kinds of things might you be instrumenting, and how might you tell whether your
people get excited about data analytics and they instantly think, oh, well, if a little bit is good, more is better. And let's have a massive analytics dashboard. And those of you who have instrumented something like Google Analytics into a software product and then look at a report, you'll quickly learn Eric's law of Google Analytics, which is at all times, no matter how badly you are screwing up, there's always at least one graph which is up and to the right. So you can bring that graph to your board meeting and show that you're being successful. And that's just an instance of the problem of having the plan to just ship stuff and see what happens, because then you are guaranteed to succeed at seeing what happens. Something is assuredly going to happen, and you can claim that thing as a success. And that's not science. So when we talk about making development more scientific, what we mean is having a strong hypothesis and saying, what really actually has to be true in order for this to make sense, and then testing that with the smallest amount of data that's absolutely necessary. And we always talk about, if you're building a product most entrepreneurs think their product is outstanding, especially in the idea stage when there's no proof. If you're building something like teleportation, you have a theory, which is 100% of people would rather teleport to work instead of having to commute, right? Everybody here with me? So if your idea is as good as teleportation, you often say, well, then I don't need to test anything. It's such a good idea, everyone will want it. But that's actually the perfect time to test. If that idea is really so good that everyone will want it, then offering that product to 10 people, we already have a very specific prediction about how many of them will say, yes, I want this product, namely all 10. And so we're always trying to tell entrepreneurs, who all, by the way, think their idea is just as good as teleportation, I'm sure you're right, but let's just double check. What could it hurt? Let's just go have 10 people try to use our product, try to maybe pre-order it or purchase it. And then since we know for sure that all 10 of them will want to, that gives us a nice reality check. So oftentimes the analytics required to do this are very, very simple, especially when we're operating in these kind of micro-scale experiments. And then as we scale up, our mantra here is to think big, start small, scale fast. So as we scale up, we have to get more sophisticated in using the right analytics in order to hold teams accountable and figure out who's really making progress. And actually that stuff, the management and the accounting, is where the bulk of the method comes in. It's not the funny, like the stuff that makes it onto bumper stickers, like pivots and MVPs. People get excited about that. But the real meat of this is math and management and accounting, and is therefore boring.
There is a really important point, though, too, which is that it's not necessarily big data. It's getting the right data.
That's right.
It's thinking through what are you really trying to accomplish, and is it working? And also the idea that you actually want to engage as early as possible with real customers. There's a story in that regard that I heard from the founders of Airbnb, that the apartment and home sharing service, when they were at the Y Combinator accelerator, they were having trouble. The service wasn't really taking off, and Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, said, "Well, where are your customers?" And they said, "Well, in New York City." And he said, "Well, then why are you here?" And they said, "Well, because we're here part of your accelerator." And he's like, "But your customers are in New York City. Why are you here?" and they went to New York, and they started traveling around talking to the customers, trying to figure out what was wrong with the service by actually talking to the customers instead of just sort of sitting back in the office trying to make up stories about it. So sometimes the data is simply getting out there on
Yeah, and it's important to understand that although we advocate talking to customers and really spending time with customers, we don't necessarily advocate listening to them. which is very confusing, I admit, but it's very important. We're not conducting focus groups here. This is not about asking customers what they want. If you spend any time with human beings, you will know they do not know what they want. And they certainly can't articulate it in a consistent way, but we're unfortunately very confident we think we know what we want. It's about conducting experiments that help us learn how people will behave. But certainly we can never do that from our office, at the whiteboard, thinking grand strategic thoughts. We have to be where the customers are and really understanding what their problem is. And in a lot of cases, we don't even know enough about our customers to formulate a hypothesis in the first place. And that's when, the kind of design thinking and kind of deep anthropological approach, where we're spending time observing customers, seeing how they actually behave, really empathizing with their problems, that's a critical element. And yet, we're often talking about engineers and product development people doing that. And certainly my training as an engineer never included time on customer empathy. That's not part of the engineering curriculum. And yet, so it's important that we kind of retrain ourselves to think about what's an efficient use of time. As we said, building the wrong thing very efficiently, that's actually not a good use of time. And so activities that normally would be outsourced to the market research team or to some marketing, we have to bring all of those techniques into the heart of product development itself.
I want to talk a little bit about failure. You mentioned, with experiments, that, of course, that most of them fail. You think of the famous line from Thomas Edison, I didn't fail 1,000 times, I found 1,000 things that did not work. And let's talk a little bit about that in the context of government, because, of course, in Silicon Valley startup culture, we expect a lot of things to fail. In government, if you fail, you tend to be penalized, and that's why, in fact, many government programs are maintained even when they do fail, because better to preserve face and pretend that it's working than to take it out of circulation. Particularly, at I think in the city level that's less the case, but certainly at national level, so you kind of have a lot of political posturing sometimes about programs. But talk to us about failure.
Yeah, well, first of all, if you are in a culture where failure is not an option, then all that you've done is you've required everybody to lie about failure, pretend it doesn't happen. That doesn't actually lead to higher quality outcomes for anybody. It leads to a lot of posturing in politics, as we all know. So we have to embrace failure, but that's not that popular, because of course we all want to succeed.
But there's a very different context, though. If you're basically saying we're running a test to gather some data, then it really isn't a failure.
It isn't a failure, that's right.
The hypothesis returned negative data. The project as a whole didn't fail. We're
really
actually
requires
iteratively using failure to improve our odds of success.
Yeah, so we're actually succeeding in creating what we call validated learning. So this is not just like a good story. Everyone who failed has a good story about what they learned, but we're trying to make it objective. To say, no, this is actually, we're learning things that are useful and that are getting us closer and closer to our goal. But that requires executive leadership and executive sponsorship to create a space where that kind of failure is safe. And the biggest thing I think we can learn as a management discipline for entrepreneurship is it's on management, it's on us as leaders to contain the costs of failure. Because right now, we generally, you can call anything an experiment, and it's like, okay, well, if it's an experiment, let's see what happens. But next thing you know, maybe thousands or even millions of people have been affected. That's actually not the kind of experiment we want. And we could have had the learning, with only 10 or 100. So a lot of the protection and kind of fear of failure that people have, they fear the consequences of a large-scale failure because we did a huge announcement and we launched it and we beat our chests about how great it was going to be, and then we create disappointment. If we experiment in obscurity with clear boundaries about how many people can be affected, what the total cost of the failure can be, who we talk to about it, if we create those boundary conditions, we can actually make it safe for people to experiment and then to admit that failure is an inevitable part of innovation. Actually, anyone who claims to have not failed is just lying to you, or they haven't actually been successful as an innovator. That's really the only possibility.
But again, coming back to this notion of minimum viable product, a key part of the idea is you want to limit the scope of the failure, both in terms of the amount of cost it takes to learn that an approach you had in mind is actually wrong, but also the number of people it affects and the number of features that you put together before figuring out whether they're the right features or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have to contain both the scope of the product itself and the scope of the experiment in terms of its impact in the world. And that's actually, when people think about how to incubate startup teams inside an established company, we often spend our time thinking about how do we protect the innovators from the parent organization. But that's exactly backwards. Our mandate has to be, how do we protect the parent organization from feeling threatened by the startup? Because middle managers, they're like ninja assassins. They will find you and kill you. Okay, you cannot hide from middle management. We all know that. So we have to figure out, how do we tell all of our middle managers that this is happening? It's happening out in the open. It's transparent. It is scary, but it's safe. It's safe because we have thought about consciously, these are the limits on how badly the innovation can go. These are the total number, there's a total cost, total amount of time, total number of customers affected, maximum. So you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of one of Nigel Jacobs' comments that the Department of New Urban Mechanics was a concentrator of risk for the city government.
Yeah.
We'll take on the risk.
Yeah, that can actually be a net plus for middle managers, because you take their riskiest, craziest people who are constantly doing things that they wish would stop. Yeah. You're like, let me make those people not your problem anymore. I'll take the blame if that thing goes wrong.
So what a good deal. You've been doing some work with government.
Yes.
Talk to us a little bit about what you've...
Yeah, first of all, I never imagined that I would have anything to do with government. I mean,
yeah, sorry.
When I started
this,
fault. I mean, yeah, it is basically Tim's fault. I wrote in the book that a startup is a human institution designed to create something new under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And I just added as a kind of throwaway line, by the way, that means it doesn't matter how big the company is, how big the organization is, or even what sector of the economy it works in. But I didn't actually think anybody would take me up on that challenge. Certainly didn't think that Tim would start making introductions to people in government. And what I learned, quite to my surprise, and is part of the reason I'm here with you today, is that entrepreneurs are everywhere, even in the public sector. And so, when they were talking about creating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in the federal government, and the president directed Anish Chopra, then his chief technology officer, to do it like a startup, we got involved in that conversation. And I had this conversation where I said, oh, well, if you were going to do that, you could build a minimum viable product instead of launching nationwide. And you don't need to build a massive call center. We could just work in one city. And we had some ideas about what that could look like. But I thought that was the last I would ever hear of it. I didn't think anybody would actually take me up on that challenge to do that. So that has been really exciting to see there. We've already talked about the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program, which is taking this idea and now institutionalizing it into a program that can do these lean startups, in 6 months on a low budget with a small team. It's been really, I mean, personally, as a citizen, find it incredibly inspiring to see that these innovators can be embraced even in a very political, very bureaucratic context.
Yeah, I guess it just, in closing, makes me think that one way to frame what we're all doing in each of the cities that are partnering with Code for America are, creating a set of minimum viable products that actually teach a different way of developing software for government, a different way of solving problems for cities, and that can spread. And that's really the thing that's most exciting. We really are seeing this idea spread. This Code for America has helped inspire the White House Innovation Fellows. Yep. And ultimately, we believe that we can tackle larger and larger problems from this foothold that we've gained.
Yeah, it's very
This
exciting.
is really the beginning. As Jen said again, quoting Jack Dorsey, this is a founding moment, and we're all continuing to march forward, reinventing government. Well, thank you very much, Eric.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
That was good.